Bienvenidos a todos. Welcome, everyone. Good evening. Hope you all are doing well and staying safe wherever you are. My name is Ethan Marcus. I'm the Director of Communications for La Hermandad Sephardi de America, the Sephardic Jewish Brotherhood of America. We're so excited to welcome you all here tonight for a wonderful course, a two-part course this week and next with our dear friend, Rabbi Haleva. Just a reminder to those of you who are joining us for the first time, this is a brand new series through what we're calling the Sephardic Digital Academy, an online forum for many amazing classes on Sephardic history, culture, Ladino language instruction, Sephardic halakha, Sephardic Torah perspectives, philosophy, cooking, and a whole lot more. If you're interested at all about finding out more about this new Digital Academy program, please feel free to reach out and find out at sephardicbrotherhood.com/Sephardic Digital Academy. And just as a reminder, if you're ever interested as well as sponsoring as well, we are a nonprofit initiative. We do rely on your support. If you ever would like to sponsor one of these classes or potentially another series, please let us know. You can email us at info@sephardicbrotherhood.com. Now, it's such a real pleasure and honor to welcome Rabbi Haleva back again for a new series. He's done a previous series before. We're so lucky to have him with us. Just a little bit of info about Rabbi Haleva. He was born and raised in Seattle, Washington, and his entire family have been members of the Sephardic Cholim congregation since arriving from the cities of Tekirdağ and Marmara in what's today Turkey in the early 20th century. He graduated from Columbia University in 1982 with a degree in mathematics and from Fordham Law School in 1986. He also attended the University of Washington, where he studied electrical engineering, graduating with a BSEE in 1996 and an MSEE in 1998. He was a long-term personal student of Chacham Professor Jose Faor de Feliz Memoria and received a semicha from the Chacham in 1983. He's a patent attorney at Patterson Sheridan, New Jersey office, and has been teaching classes in Talmud and rabbinics in the Andalusian tradition, as well as various works of Maimonides in the Sephardic communities of Seattle, New York, New Jersey, and beyond since 1993. Without further ado, Rabbi Haleva, bechavod.
Thank you, Ethan. Hello, everybody. Nochada buena. Let me get my slides. So tonight we're going to talk about Sephardic solutions to the Aguna problem. I'm sure everybody who's been around has heard of get refusers and protests, and what do you do if there's a get refuser, and what can the woman do whose husband refuses to give her a divorce. And very often, if it's a foreigner and he runs back to wherever he's from, often Israel, that's what we hear about here. They marry women from New York, New Jersey. Something goes wrong, they go back to Israel and never to be found again. So what does that poor girl do? The short answer is, if you don't take measures at the time of the wedding, nothing. You can't do anything about it, not really. But you could take measures at the time of the wedding to fix the problem. So this woman who's married but whose husband has left her and who wants to get a divorce but cannot is known by the Hebrew term Aguna. And by the way, so I was telling Ethan before, if anybody has questions in the middle, I'm more than happy to have live questions. I think there's a blue raise your hand feature. If you want to ask a question, do the blue raise your hand. I think Ethan will be watching for that, and then we can unmute you and have you ask the question. So we like give and take. So let's start with what is, oh, by the way, this is going to be a two-parter. So we're doing the same thing next week. And what's the game plan? So there was a first Sephardic response to the Aguna problem in 1929 by the entire court, rabbinic court, Beit Din of Istanbul. And they published a 60-page document, which we're going to refer to in a moment, about how you do a marriage on condition. And if the condition fails some years into the marriage, then the marriage is dissolved by the court and the woman is free. There is another answer that was articulated even before that, long before that, I think as early back as the year 350 or so in the Talmud Bavli, in the Babylonian Talmud. And that's, I think, an even better answer, but that's the second part. But first, we're going to develop what is an aguna. So as you know, in all Hebrew words, the first thing you want to do is determine the root or the shoresh. So the root of Aguna, first of all, Aguna is an adjective. And it's the female adjective. The male version would be Agun. And actually it's an ayin, so it would be Aruna. And in Hebrew, the noun oren means anchor, like in sailing, like in, seafaring sailing. So it's a nautical term. An Aguna is a woman who is anchored, i.e. she cannot move and is stuck in place, like an anchored ship. I think there's an English sailing term that is equivalent that people use to say you're stuck. I think it's, I forgot it now, something to do with the wind. I think it's being cast in irons or something like that because you can't move. So how do you get to be an Aguna? Easy. You get married, you want a divorce, and your husband refuses to give it to you. In Jewish law, only a husband can sever the marriage entity. And here, for example, is Maimonides, Harambam. So I believe that Harambam is the best reference for Jewish law because he's the only individual ever to restate the entire Jewish law from A to Z. In 1,000 chapters, that book is known as the Mishneh Torah. Nobody else did that. Maran addresses maybe 40% of the various titles of Jewish law in the Shulchan Aruch, and some of the Geonim wrote books on halacha, but none of them, nobody ever, before or after Maimonides, except Rabbeinu HaKadosh, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, and his court, who published the Mishnah. Since then, nobody ever addressed the entire corpus of rabbinic law from A to Z. So we're going to refer, in here Maimonides has laws of divorce called Hilchot Gerushin. To divorce is Gimal Reshin Lecharesh, to divorce. So En ha'isha mitgareshet ella bichtab sheyagia la. A woman is not divorced unless she receives a writing, uchtab zeh hu hanikra get, and this writing is known as a get. By the way, get is not Hebrew, it's Aramaic, and it means a document. So you could have a get of divorce, you could have a get that emancipates a slave, it's called get shahrur, and you could have other getin, which just simply means document. And there are 10 aspects of biblical divorce, and here they are. Now I'm skipping some of them, but the key one is Shelo yigaresh ha'ish ela birsono. Aval ha'ish, right. Aval ha'isha mitgareshet lirsona v'shelo lirsona. But a woman, so a man can never be forced to divorce. Ella birsono only works if he intends it, if he wants it. But the woman really has no say. If he wants to divorce her, he may, and whether she agrees or doesn't agree. The key rule is, if a man refuses to execute and deliver a divorce, the wife has no power to end the marriage, and therefore no power to marry anyone else, unless and until the husband agrees to divorce her. And we all know it's not that common, but it's not uncommon that when people get divorced, sometimes the husband feels financial pressure, so he uses the only leverage he has and he refuses to grant a divorce, and that we have many Agunot. And if this situation perpetuates, he may leave and no one knows where to find him, and that's a problem. So what are some of the early answers to this problem of a woman who needs a divorce but can't get one or cannot secure the consent of the husband? Here's again the Mishneh Torah. Now, the rabbis, the courts, the Jewish legal system, has some bases where even if the husband refuses, he's required to give the get. And if he doesn't, to the extent they can get custody of him, they force him. So, Misha Din Noten, someone for whom the law dictates that we should force him to divorce his wife, and he didn't want to. Bedin shel Yisrael bechol makom ubechol zeman, a Jewish court, a court that operates and judges based on rabbinite law, Talmudic law, in any place and any time, does not have to be a national court. does not have to have jurisdiction over a majority of the Jewish nation. Wherever it is, they may beat him until he says, okay, I consent. And he writes the get, v'hu get kasher, that's 100% valid. And similarly, if Gentiles beat him and they told him, do what the Israelite court tells you, or an Israelite used goy operators to force or put pressure on the husband until such point that he actually does hand over the get, how does that kasher? It's still valid. And if the goyim on their own, the Gentiles on their own, me'asman, that's what that means, on their own forced him until he wrote the get, how does it get pasul? If only Gentiles force him, though, then it's not a valid get. Okay. V'lama lo batil get ze sharehu anus. Now, of the 4 cases here, 3 of them, it's a valid get. The last one is if the goyim on their own forced him, which is invalid. Why are the first 3 valid anyway, though? He's forced. He's anus. And a general principle of rabbinite law is ones rahamana chatre. If you are forced, like you're starving and are on a desert island and it's Kippur, of course you eat. And if you're on the same desert island or a shipwreck and it's Shabbat, well, of course you do whatever you need to do to get out of the ocean and onto dry land. So ones, if you're forced, if situations force you to violate the law, you may. And also, you cannot take an act that requires consent by force. So he's an anus, he's forced. We would say in Ladino, forzoso. Ben biyad goyim, ben biyad Israel, whether it's in the hands of Gentiles or in the hands of Israelites, she'en omrim anus ella lemi shenilhas nilhak la'asot davar she'eno hayab min haTorah la'asoto. Well, what they did, the rabbis carved out an exception. And they said, although you can't force somebody to deed you their property, and if you do, you can, the grantor gets the property back as soon as he goes to court. And you can't force somebody to buy something or sell something or do any other act like that or give you a gift. And if you do, and they give it to you under duress, the rabbinite court will undo the transaction each and every time. But here's an exception. That we all say that about something that you're not required by law. Like somebody who was beaten until he'd agreed to sell, or natan, or to give. But somebody whose evil inclination, and if you caught my last series of classes, that's identified with imagination. It's not like an external entity or like the devil or like Jiminy Cricket standing on your shoulder, but it's your own imagination. Levatel mitzvah, to avoid a mitzvah, to ignore it, or la'asod avera, or to do something wrong. And he was beaten until he actually did the thing he was required to do, or he was beaten, and as a result of the beating, he avoided the forbidden act or item. That is not a case of under duress, but rather it was he who put himself under duress with his imagination, fantasy-based, pure desire, fleeting desire-based ideas. And so we don't mind forcing him to do the right thing. So there are certain cases where a husband is required to divorce the wife. Yes, he has the authority to do it, but the court says you have to do it in certain circumstances. And if he refuses, they would force him. The problem with compulsion is the following. So here's Maimonides' summary. Lefichach, therefore, mi she'eno roseh legaresh, someone who doesn't want to divorce, me'achar she'u roseh liot misra, but given the fact that he wants to remain an Israelite, rosehu la'asot kol ha'misvot, in theory, he wants to do all the misvot, or in theory, he would say, I would like to do all the misvot to the extent I can. and I want to avoid transgressions or sins. And it's his imagination that forced him. He was mad at her, or he wanted to take revenge, or all these things that the more human foible side of him kind of wanted to do. An impulsive emotion, or what, if you know this professor from Israel named Kahneman, and he has a model for human thought where there's a stage 1 and stage 2. Stage 1 is often impulsive, knee-jerk reactions. Stage 2 is when you deliberate over something and you really take a look at it from all sides. So when you refuse to give your wife a divorce, it's usually because you're fighting with her, or maybe you feel that you hate her, and so your Kahneman stage 1 knee-jerk impulsive response takes over, and you say, I'll never give her the gift. But you don't.
Sorry,
yes.
There's one question in the chat. I think.
Sure.
When you say beaten, quote unquote, do you mean physically hitting? If not, what does beaten mean?
Yes, lehakot means to beat. But remember, the Jewish court has one of its punishments is beating, right? Instead of spending 8 years in jail, we thought it's more productive to beat people than to ruin their life and their livelihood and their wife and children's livelihood. So you heard about it in the Torah. There's talking about how many lashes, no more than 40. So the rabbinic court for certain rabbinic transgressions can beat an individual. Yeah, absolutely. That's the law. Now that law is 1,500 years old, and in the Talmud, and going back, it's 3,000 years old. So we may try different kinds of pressure today, but the United States government does more than beating. When they catch somebody that they need to talk, they use waterboarding and all kinds of stuff like that. So it's not unheard of. Okay, so now here's Maimonides' summary. Back to that.
Sorry, one other follow-up question just popped up.
Yes.
Was beating or lashes permissible with local courts, meaning outside the Beth Din HaGadol?
In Spain, they did, but rarely, and only for handing over fellow Jews to the Gentile authorities for whatever reason. They did not do it as prescribed by Masechet Makot. So there's a entire tractate of the Talmud called Makot, which means beatings or lashes, devoted to when the court can do it. But by Jewish law, no. You can only, a local court may, when there is in existence a Sanhedrin that is sitting in the temple at Jerusalem. Because in that case, every Jewish court in Israel is a subsidiary, or it's under the control of the Sanhedrin. Just like the local federal courts in, let's say, Denver, Colorado, are under the control of the appellate courts, which themselves are under the control of the Supreme Court. Outside of Israel, no. The Batei Din did not have that authority. But in Spain, they actually did assert it on rare occasions. In the case of a moser, it's called, someone who hands you over to the government. So now, here's the problem with compulsion, though. Lo haya hadin noten shekofin oto lecharesh. What if the rabbinate law was such that you could not force this individual to divorce? V'ta'u bedin shel Yisrael, and the bedin, the Israelite bedin, made an error, and they beat him and forced him anyway. O shehayu hedyotot, oh, they were not judges, just regular folks. Ve'ansuhu ad shegiresh, and they forced him until he gave a get. Harez get pasul, the woman is not divorced anyway. So you have to be very careful with this old remedy of compulsion, because if you make a boo-boo, the woman is not divorced anyway. You beat up the husband erroneously. Now everybody hates you, and she's still not divorced, and she's still an Aguna. And now you probably poisoned the well if she's going to come back in a year and say, I'm an Aguna, you have to help me. So what are some modern answers? We're going to look at three. The first one is the RCA Prenup. You may have heard of this. It's the Rabbinical Council of America. And in a lot of synagogues now, a lot of Sephardic synagogues, the rabbis require or strongly encourage or force with social pressure couples getting married to sign the RCA Prenup. The RCA Prenup, I'm just quoting part of it. What it tries to do is, by contract, give the RCA, the Rabbinical Council of America's internal Jewish court, their Beit Din, authority to decide certain issues of the marriage. and the people submit to binding arbitration by this rabbinic court, which makes it legal. And if you have failed to appear, if one party wants to divorce, you summon the other to the RCA court. And if the summonee fails to appear, there are penalties. So here's what it says. If either party fails to appear before the Bet Din of America upon reasonable notice, the Bet Din of America may issue its decision despite the defaulting party's failure to appear and may impose costs and other penalties as legally permitted. Both parties obligate themselves to pay for the services of the Bet Din of America. Failure of either party to perform his or her obligations under this agreement shall make that party liable for all costs, including reasonable attorney's fees, incurred by one side in order to obtain the other party's performance of the terms of this agreement. So basically, you commit to show up if your wife wants to get a divorce and she summons you. But if you don't show up, they assess $150 a day. Suppose you don't care, or suppose you're going bankrupt, or suppose you live in the cash economy. Nothing happens. So the types of husband who create the Aguna situations anyway are not the law-abiding citizens who, once they sign an Rca Prenup, are likely to show up when they're summoned. There's some people, when you sue them, they say, go to hell. Well, this type of husband is most probably in that camp. So I'm not a big fan of the Rca Prenup because it sounds good, but it doesn't really do anything. And I've heard of dozens of situations where the husband just doesn't show up. He says, I don't care. He runs away. He starts a new life, marries somebody else, or lives with somebody else, and the woman is stuck. Alternative. Instead of, so from now on, we're going to study two possible solutions, both coming from Sephardic circles. The truth is, in non-Sephardic circles, they're kind of afraid of these. I'm not sure why, but they are. And the attack is as follows. Instead of forcing somebody to divorce, or trying to force them, or by contract, by assessment of daily penalties, or by beating them, or any of these kind of things we looked at before, instead of doing that, we plan. At the time of the marriage, we don't do an absolute marriage that would absolutely bind the woman. What we do is we create a condition inherent in the marriage from the beginning, as you say in Latin, in legal context, ab initio. From the very beginning, there's a built-in, or some people say baked-in condition to the marriage that can, if the condition is not fulfilled, the marriage is dissolved. It's called a condition subsequent. I'm marrying you on condition that X, Y, and Z remains true and in effect. At any time such that A, B, or C condition fails to be accurate, fails to be in existence, fails to be performed, then the marriage is dissolved. You can do that, and this is what was done. When was it first done? So Jewish law allows for conditions to marriage. Most of them, though, are more on the formation of the marriage. For example, a man says to a woman, knowing full well that her family wants somebody who's Jewishly literate. So he says, here is some money that I'm giving you for Kiddushin to marry me on condition that I am a karra. Karra means, from the verb kore, kof resh aleph, somebody who can recite with precision, with the tune and with the vowels on an unpointed scroll, the Chumash, the Nebi'im, and the Ketubim, the entire Mikra. And that was common, by the way. In pre-modern times, around the time of the Tannaim, the Talmud, or the Emoraim, the Mishnah, the Talmud, people could do that. So just as an aside, you know, today when you get called up for the Haftarah, usually you don't read it. Usually the Hazan reads it. Some people try to read it. Of the people that try to read it, some do it well, some do it okay, some don't do it well. But in the old days, and you're reading it from a book, in the old days, there were no printed books with vowels. So there were just scrolls, and every synagogue had a scroll, not just of the Torah, but of the entire 24 books of the Bible, which we call those 24, in Ladino, the 24, or we also call Mikra. The word Mikra was borrowed by the Arabs, and they took it as Quran, and that's their holy scriptures. When you got called up to the Haftarah, you did two things. You chose the Haftarah on the spot, and your choice was to choose something that reflects in some way or echoes some aspect or point of the Perashah. It wasn't printed in a book, it was up to you. And also, they would give you the big scroll that the synagogue had with the entire Bible in it, and you would turn it to the point of the prophets that you're choosing, and you would read it from the unpointed scroll. Just saw the consonant, just like the Sefer Torah. Who could do that? Well, today, hardly anybody. So that's why I often joke, today, the average rabbi is less literate than Jesus himself. Because in the New Testament, there's a story that Jesus went to a synagogue in in Galilee, and read the Haftarah. Now, why would the New Testament, why would the writers of the four, the Evangelion, I forget how you say it in English, but the four main narratives of Jesus' life, why would they write that? Because in the old days, when they wrote it in the context of the time, let's say the year 100, reading the Haftarah was only for Talmidei Chachamim. You had to be fluent. Now, a lot of people were in fact fluent because we taught that in school. But you had to read the Haftarah, means you choose it and you read it from the scroll on the spot. So if you make a condition when you get married that you're a Karra, it means you must be at least as literate as Jesus. And if you're not, if you were puffing, and you could only read your Bar Mitzvah Perashah, but you don't know much else, the marriage is invalid. So most of the conditions in Jewish law for marriages are conditions that are fulfilled at the time the marriage is made. You either know whether the condition is fulfilled or not fulfilled. Like if you say I'm wealthy and you turn out to be not, the condition is not fulfilled, marriage is invalid. And there's various things like that. This condition, though, is one where we say a certain state of affairs exists now, but that the maintenance or permanence of that state of affairs is a condition to this marriage remaining valid. And if at any time, for a discernible time period, these conditions, which we call the required state of affairs, do not exist or cease to exist, then the marriage is undone. It's similar to a triple net lease. So when you lease, let's say you own a building. Let's say you own a building in Manhattan. And let's say, unlike the actual story we're living, you got a lot of tenants and everybody wants your space, and you can charge more and more rent each time you renew your lease. Each and every one of those leases has the following clauses. The tenant promises to insure the premises and name the landlord as an additional insured, and to pay all the taxes and comply with all the zoning requirements and anything like that at his expense. If for some reason the tenant doesn't pay the taxes, the lease is dissolved. If for some reason the tenant doesn't carry insurance, or does but doesn't carry enough, the lease could be dissolved. Now, most landlords don't kick out the tenant for that, but they have the right. They have the legal right to do that. Or if they use the premises in a way that is obnoxious or bothersome to the neighbors, that rises to the level of police action, you kick them out. So you lease it to The Gap, and at night, the salespeople start to have parties going on till 3 in the morning with a loud bass line in their music, and the police come. Most landlords will kick you out after a couple of times of that. So that's the model. It exists in other areas of Jewish law. And so here's the actual source from Istanbul. This is a book that says Mahberet Kiddushin al Tanai. The essay, or the little, it's a small book, livriko, you might say, libretto, on Kiddushin, marriage on condition. And it was signed by all of the members of the Bedin of Istanbul, and it was issued in the year 1929, and it was published by this fellow in the Bidfus says here. Let's see if I can blow this up a little bit, see if I can see it better, and you could see it better. Let's try this. Okay, here we go. I don't know if you can read down here, Bilfus Il-Kahir. I don't know who Il-Kahir is, but some printer in Istanbul. Istanbul Dekranyan Han 19. So I know Han was a kind of a geographical part of the city of Istanbul. Dekranyan Han 19. I don't know what that means, but that's what it was, where it was.
Someone says the name might be Abu Khair.
Abu Khair. Oh, not a kaf?
No, Abu Khair, like the name is a Sephardic last name, the printer.
Maybe. Looks like a kaf because here's his bed, but who knows? Maybe. Could be. Okay.
And there's another question here, by the way, sorry.
Yes.
Is the marriage invalid from the point on, or is it invalidated from the start of the process?
From the start. From the start. So you're not breaking the marriage. You're saying that the marriage never was valid. Unlike the lease example I gave. And we don't care, but that's fine, because under Jewish law, children don't need to be of married parents. If you have a child and you're the father, the child has your yahos, has your lineage. Married or not married, makes no difference whatsoever. We don't have this thing of bastard. In Jewish law, a mamzer, which is the closest thing to the English bastard, is somebody who's the product of a forbidden union. Means someone who you're not allowed to marry ever. If you're allowed to marry a woman, but you just don't, and you have children with her, the children, it's no difference between those children had you been married or not married. So it dissolves it all from the beginning. So what happened that the Beit Din in Istanbul decided to issue this en banc opinion? En banc means by all the judges, the entire judiciary working for the Beit Din of Istanbul at the time they signed it. So what happened? Well, there was Ottoman Empire upheavals. Now, in normal situations, communal enactments and social pressures are enough to protect the right of a woman to obtain a divorce from her husband. You know, the husband does business with people, he knows people, he has friends in the community. He's not going to go live as a Turkish Muslim in some other neighborhood. It just doesn't work. His life wouldn't work. So if the marriage falls apart, the family, her family, which may be related to him, and oftentimes was, would pressure him, and so he wouldn't be, you know, a bad egg about it. He'd give her the divorce. The problem became acute in times of great demographical upheavals, as during two examples: the expulsion from the Iberian Peninsula in 1492, where families were torn apart. Sometimes the husband was in jail with the Inquisition, and the wife had to leave. Sometimes vice versa. Sometimes there were just people were torn apart, trying to escape here or there and send for the woman, and they got split up. And there was no possibility of obtaining a divorce from the husband because the wife didn't know where the husband was. And yet she knew she was married, so she's stuck in the new place. Let's say she goes to Italy or Greece or Turkey. What can she do? A similar demographical phenomenon, perhaps on a smaller scale, took place among the Sephardic Jews in the Ottoman Empire period at the beginning of last century. The economic situation of the Ottoman Empire was rapidly deteriorating. We all know that. The West was closing in on them. In fact, there was a war starting in 1913. The introduction of the steamboat opened new economic possibilities to the poor who wished to immigrate. It didn't take forever to go to America. You didn't have to go on a sailing ship. You could go on a steamboat. And you could go pick one up in, let's say, Le Havre in France, or in Cairo. In addition to economic factors, immigration was prompted by the specter of war. For the first time in history, the Jew in the Ottoman Empire was being drafted for military service. The prospect of having to fight in the Turkish army during the First World War was a strong incentive for hasty departures. The newly acquired mobility and the opening of a new social and economic opportunities, in contrast to the gloomy prospect of military service in the Turkish army, had an enormous impact on the Jewish community, principally on fathers and husbands. You all know that many of the Sephardim, certainly the Spanish-speaking ones who came to the United States, the men came first and later sent for their wives and often their parents. So my papu, Jack Haleva, first came in like 1915 from Cuba. I don't know when he went to Cuba. He went to Cuba, let's say in 1910. I guess he couldn't get into the US. He spoke Spanish, so Cuba made sense. Then he gets out of Cuba, he comes here in 1915, He's by himself. He was single, but many people like him, his cousins, they were married. The wife was in Turkey. And as soon as they got established, they would send for the wife and send for the parents. So this was pretty common. But the problem was, what about those husbands who never sent for the wives? What about those husbands who the wife never heard from again? She's stuck in Turkey. What is she supposed to do? So this responsum, or teshuvah, was published as a separate booklet, which I just showed you here, under the title Mahberet Kiddushin al-Tanai. It was published in 1924. Formally, it is a proposal written by the Bet Din of Constantinople, Istanbul, addressed to rabbis occupying positions with authority to make such decisions. The book is divided into 5 parts. 1, it's 60 pages, so I thought I'd summarize it in English for everybody rather than read through it. To read through it would take a whole lot more than an hour, and the audience would have to know rabbinic Hebrew. It's written in what we call letras rabbinicas. Some of you call that Rashi script. We call it letras rabbinicas because we used it before Rashi's commentary was ever written. So here's the summary. It has an introduction containing a list of the major causes for the abandonment of wives. That's the first 3 pages. Then there's the she'elah, question, proposing that a formal stipulation should be made at the time of the wedding, stating that the Bet Din could terminate the marriage and the actual content of the stipulation. And we'll get to that in a minute as soon as I finish the summary, what exactly the statement was. It's here. Tanai B'Kiddushin. This is there from that book. Now, part 2, an analysis of the principle no conditions can be applied to weddings, or en tinaim b'nisuin. After a formulation of this principle, it is demonstrated that a majority of the poskim, means those rabbis who write responsa, which give an advisory opinion. No rabbi has any authority after the year 500. None, 0. No matter where you are, no matter who you are, no matter where you study. So when they tell you you ask for a Pesach, that's an advisory opinion. That was more or less speculating. What would the Jewish court do today if they were here? And it's a guess. So it's demonstrated that the majority of the poskim maintain that this condition, or this principle, you can't make a condition in weddings, is only rabbinic, not biblical. I'll skip this part. And so he also examines the position of Rama, who's the Ashkenazi glossator to the Shulchan Aruch. You may know him. His name is Moshe Isserles. He already recorded a position that at the time of the wedding, you can stipulate that if this woman would become a widow and she would then be obligated to be the Yevama, levirate. It means Yevama, you know this mitzvah of Yibum, where if a man dies childless, his brothers are supposed to marry his wife, and the firstborn out of the union with the brother inherits the property of the deceased. That's called Yibum. A lot of people didn't want to, the families were large. You're a girl, you're marrying one brother. You certainly would never have married his brothers. So you want to make sure that if for some weird reason your husband dies and you don't have children, you want to get out of that Yibum. What if the brother likes you and he doesn't? The way you get out of Yibum is called halisa. What if the guy's brother wants to keep you? Now you're stuck. So what they did in the Ashkenazic lands was they made a condition that if they die, the husband dies childless, the marriage is void ab initio if she would be subject to Yibum, to levirate marriage. And that's what they did. So the Istanbul Bet Din not only quoted Sephardic sources, it quoted every source it could possibly find in analyzing this question, which is why it took 60 pages. Moreover, they noted there are no grounds to distinguish between stipulations designed to circumvent this principle in order to terminate a regular marriage or a levirate wedding. Therefore, you could use the Ashkenazi Pesach about levirate marriage, about Yibum, as a precedent, because it's not distinguished simply because it was only invoked for Yibum. Even though that was the case, legally, it's just as valid a precedent for a regular marriage. Third part, an in-depth analysis of the legality of the conditions that they're proposing. Means we're going to read it in a moment, but they had a number of conditions, and they discuss why those conditions are legal and valid conditions to a marriage. 4, a note concerning the status of the children born before the termination of the marriage. Like I said, they would inherit either way, and their father is their father, and that's that. Next, 5, the conclusion, containing a summary of the major points in section 3, which is the analysis, and a note referring to the power of the rabbinic court to terminate a marriage and the practice of exercising this power when other legal considerations have already rendered the marriage invalid. This Pisak is signed by the 5 members of the Beit Din, followed by a short paragraph of approval and the signature of the chief rabbi. Let me just jump to show you who signed it. You recognize the names probably. So here are the 5 people who signed it. They are the members of the Istanbul Beit Din in 1924. Ishaq ben Eliezer, he doesn't put his last name. This says, Hashem yishmereu v'chayeu, may God guard him, kilewarda el Dios, and he should give him life. Rafael David Sabban, that is a Moroccan name. Interesting that this Haham was sitting on the court in Istanbul.
He was actually the chief rabbi.
No, I think Bejerano was at the time.
Right, at the time, but then he becomes locum
Yes,
tenens,
yeah, that's right.
and then
yes.
eventually chief rabbi of Turkey.
That's right. So he signs nicely. I like that. Sephardi Tahor. Yitzhak Shaki. We know the name Shaki in Seattle. Yaakov Arguete. Of course, I know that family. Moshe ben Habib. That's a long established family going back to right after the expulsion in the Sephardic Jews in Israel and in Turkey. There was a Levi ben Habib. There was a Moshe ben Habib. They both wrote responsa, etc. This is not politically correct, but the actual Moshe ben Habib of the 16th century has a teshuvah that a Sephardi may not wear tefillin created in the Ashkenazi style, for whatever it's worth. Okay, those are the guys who signed it, the Hachamim who signed it. Before we read, we're going to read the condition itself. But before we do that, I want to give you the basic law behind what they're doing here. You may make a condition on Kiddushin. This is Harambam again in Hilchot Ishut. Ishut is the name he gives to the book that restates the law in Masechet Kiddushin. Hamekadesh al tenai. If someone marries a woman on condition. Im nipkayem hatenai mekudeshet. If the condition is fulfilled, she's his wife. V'im lo nitkayem ena mekudeshet. But if it's not fulfilled, whether it's on him or on her, she's not married to him. Ben shehaya hatenai min ha'ish, ben shehaya min ha'isha. And in what I just said, it doesn't matter whether the condition is on him or on her. V'chol tenai sheba'olam, ben bekiddushin, ben begerushin, ben b'mekah u'memkar. And every condition in the world, from the point of view of Jewish law, whether it's kiddushin, whether it's marriage, whether it's gerushin, divorce, you can divorce on a condition also. Ben means, in other words, I'm giving you this divorce on condition that X happens. If X happens, she's divorced. If X doesn't happen within a certain time, she's not. Ben I'm selling you this building or this horse or this factory on the condition that ABC, same thing. Ben bishar dine mamon, in any financial or monetary transaction, sarich liyot bitnai arba'a debarim. You have to have 4 elements to make it a valid condition. And if you do, then it's valid. If you don't, it's not. I'm not going to go through those. That's the general commercial law of rabbinic jurisprudence. Now, so I just want you to know, you can make a condition on a marriage. Here's the Tanai that they made in Istanbul. Tanai bakidushin, condition on marriages. So the first pillar, first principle, you might say, on which we built our building, that's this, they're calling this legal mechanism of building, hu hadina muskam, is the well-agreed law, umforash pashas poskim, which is explicit in both the Talmud and all the rabbis who write Tishubot. Kichol ish ve'isha rashaim lehik not bishad kiddushin kol ma sheyirsu, that any man and any woman has the power and the authority to stipulate any condition they wish at the time of the marriage. The only thing you cannot do is something that would violate Jewish law. That's kind of like federal supremacy. I can make any condition I want in a contract, but I cannot make a condition that says you can lease this property on condition that you let no Hispanic people come through the door. So that's against Title VII, against discrimination. You can't do that. Federal supremacy would violate or vitiate that condition even if you attempted it. So in our Jewish context, suppose you say, you are married to me, Miss Bejerano, on condition that you eat Hametz on Pesach. You cannot make such a condition because she's not allowed to eat Hametz on Pesach. So if you married her, you're married to her anyway because the condition is erased effectively by law. Now, if the condition is not fulfilled, if the condition is not fulfilled, this woman is completely free and allowed to marry anybody in the marketplace. Means any Tom, Dick, and Harry. In rabbinic jurisprudence, if you want to say any old guy, you say muteret lashuk. She's permitted to the market because nobody got married in the market. You know, that's vergüenza to do that. You know, this is explicit in the Talmudic tractate known as Kiddushin. Ubtur Shulchan Aruch, and in Shulchan Aruch Eben Ha'ezer, the third of the 4 sections of the Shulchan Aruch is about male-female relations. Siman Lamed Het, number 38. Paragraph 38. Ubchen al pi yesod zeh ala biyadenu limso ta'ala umazur. So we decided to lehasil benotenu, find a way based on conditions in marriage to save our daughters. Asher Tinasen al-ish, who may get married to a person, from today, means the day they signed this responsum and afterwards, from being stuck in a pit or from the chains of ha'argun, being an aguna, being anchored, by means of making a condition in kiddushin, דהיינו, שבעת ששולח החתן לחלתו, הטבעת לשם סבלונות, כנהוג פה עירנו, ובעת מסירת הטבעת מידו לידה לשם קידושין, יתנה ויאמר. So this is interesting. He says, you have to recite the condition we're about to tell you twice. Once, when the novio, the groom, sends to the novia, the bride, a ring, and it could be other jewelry too, l'shem sablunot. So have any of you ever heard of ashuar? You know what ashuar is? Syrians call it a swanny. It's when at the time of the wedding, the man's family has a bunch of gifts for the woman. Fancy bathrobes, lingerie, jewelry, perfumes, all this kind of stuff. And the woman's family has a party for mostly women, and they display all the gifts from the husband's family on some tables, and everybody kind of oohs and ahs, etc. So that was called ashuar. It was a nice custom. I think in Seattle, people did it a little bit in the 1930s. Probably the last one was in 1940 or 50, some, and I haven't heard about it in 60 years. I don't think anybody does it anymore, which is a shame, but that's called sablunot, which is like sheets. You would send sheets because sheets was to have fine cotton sheets like you would buy from Cairo. You know, that Egyptian cotton was not no shaka, as we say in Espanol. It's not a joke. It was a quality item. It was an expensive item. And the family would show their status by giving very fancy gifts at the ashuar. So you did it twice, once at the ashuar, and once at the time you put the ring from your hand as the man to her hand as the woman for the purpose of kiddushin. That would generally be in the synagogue. When you did both of those, or each of those, I should say, you had to recite the following thing. That if the following would ever come to be, שבהמשך הימים ישים האיש לדרך פעמיו, that in the passage of time, the man would set his feet to go on a journey, בלי רשות אשתו, without his wife's permission. או גם אם ילך ברשותה, or if he would go on a journey, like to America or to France or to Argentina, we're far away we're talking about, with her permission, lizman mugbal, for a limited time. And he stays longer. And he stays there without her permission longer than the specified time, for example, for 3 years. So the time was 3 years and he stayed there now 5 years. Or for some reason, the wife summonses him to the Beddin in Istanbul. He says, I think you have to give me a divorce. I want the Dayanim to look at this. And the husband doesn't show, that was rare, or he doesn't accept. He doesn't listen to the court who tells him you have to divorce. Or if the husband dies, this is the same thing as the Ashkenazi Pesach of Ramah from the 1500s, which is why they mentioned it in the analysis, as I told you, and now they put it in the condition, because that has an explicit precedent in another community. They thought it had precedence and gravitas. If she would fall in front of the brother-in-law, that's how you say it in Hebrew, and she would therefore have to marry him. And this latter person, either it could be you don't like him, but it also could be that he's gone. So you're legally required to marry him. That also is a case of being an Aguna. You have no choice. You can't marry anybody else until he gives you a halisa. Or he says, I want to marry you. I'm not going to give you a halisa. For whatever reason. I don't know what that abbreviation is. Or if something unsavory happens, if the husband becomes crazy, literally means the sicknesses of the spirit, but that's how you say mental illness. Even in the Bible, Shaul was described as having a ruach ra'ah, an evil spirit. That means he went crazy in the end. Or beholi debkei, or I think this means consumption. Literally, it means a sickness that sticks to you. A stick, debek in the modern Hebrew is glue. Debek means to stick to. Like ve'atem hadebekim b'Adonai Elohechem. Those of you, Israel, who stick to your God. So I think that means consumption. It's like a long-term illness that does not ever resolve. Or if he had a real bad illness and he hid it and she didn't know about it. Or like multiple sclerosis, you know if you have it, but you can cover up tremors at a younger age. And then they emerge at, 40 or 50 and you can't stop them anymore. Or anything similar to this. Because it's impossible for her, or such that it's impossible for her to live with a snake, a poisonous snake in one narrow area. It means like you don't have to live with a demon in a hovel, we would say in English. Azai.
There's a question from Haham Greenberg.
Yes.
Holy Mitabek is communicable.
Oh, okay. And how do you know that?
I've seen it in this Hamed's will. He tells his wife to sell his clothing to his students, who will surely pay double what they're worth, unless he dies for Holy Mitabek, in which case sell it to the local Arabs. Asher zirmat sim zirmatam ubisar hamurim bisaram.
So Debke, you say means contagious means?
Yeah, contagious. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much.
Donada.
Is there anything like this which makes it impossible for her to live with a demon in a hovel in English, but it literally means with a snake in one narrow area. Therefore, if any of these things occur or emerge later on, after the wedding, no matter how long after, retroactively, the marriage will be dissolved. And whatever money he gave her for the kiddushin, the Sephardim used to really gild the lily sometimes on the money for the kiddushin. Nowadays, they want to make it a fixed kind of a small ring, or some Sephardim, like at my wedding, I gave a piece of silver. It was a couple of ounces, right? Everybody knew what it was worth. There was no question about it. But the Sephardim used to gild the lily, in the sense. Like there's a Talmudic story about the daughters of Rabbi Yanai. You had to bring buckets of gold coins in order to marry them. Lo yu ella matana be'alma. Whatever you gave her for kiddushin is not refundable. Final sale. But it's just considered a present. She doesn't have to get he doesn't have to get a get kasher, doesn't have to get a divorce from him, and she doesn't have to get a halisa from his brother if that's the situation. I think we should stop here, but we'll continue this next Wednesday, where we'll explain this, sum it up. I'll read you the end, what they said. They had some nice things to say at the end, which are not of a legal nature, but explaining why they did what they did. There was a comment to them by a Chacham in Cairo, Yaakov Moshe Toledano, very famous Chacham. And then there's a better alternative to even this. But stay tuned. Same time, same bat channel. Okay?
One or two additional questions in the chat.
Yes, sir.
With such a need to create a kiddushin with conditions to help agunot, was there ever proposed a solution that women could give a get, especially in extreme cases of abuse?
If you plan for it. If you don't plan for it, no, then you're supposed to resort to the court. So we're in a weird situation where we don't have functioning courts. I don't know of any Sephardic community anywhere who has a general jurisdiction court. They have like arbitration, but they don't have a court where the dayanim are masters of the entire law, and they could judge like better than a judge in regular American court or Israeli court or wherever you are, Indian court. All of those are bad experiences, and I'm a lawyer, but including American court most of the time. And we offered an alternative, but we don't do that anymore. So I think the only answer now is what I call the even better alternative, but you have to plan for it at the time of the wedding, which is easy to do. At the time of the wedding now, the rabbi has a form, the ketubah, and there's a kind of a protocol that everybody goes through. You could just easily add this solution here of the Istanbuli Betin or the other solution, which I'll tell you about next time. It takes literally 10 minutes.
Then one other question here from our friend Aaron Levy. Similarly, would they have been guilty of yichud the prior years in the case of children out of marriage?
Would they have been guilty of what?
Yichud.
Oh, yichud with who?
We referred to previously regarding the children, what makes a legitimate child versus the mamzer. We're speaking before.
No. To be a mamzer, it has to be one of the arayot. So if you had an affair, a long-term, decades-long affair with a woman, but you never married her, you can have children with her, and there's no peram and their yachos. There's no taint on their lineage whatsoever, and they fully inherit you. Anything else?
No, that looks like it's it. Chacham, thank you so much. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Inshallah, Seker al Dio. We'll see you all next week.
So if you have any questions you think of those, and we'll answer those at the outset of next class before we go to this. There's about 1/3 left, so I can answer as many questions as you like. Okay?
Great. Thank you so much, Chacham. Thank you all for joining us tonight.
Okay.
See you.
Okay, bye-bye.